let's get started. So it's a water storage tank mixing roundtable. And a wise man said to me that the first time I did a roundtable, wise man said, tank mixing is still in its infancy. That was Ralph W. And that was 4 years ago. I dare say that's still true today. So as far as my panel goes, we've got over 123 years of experience here. Doing the math, that's over 20 years per person. Amazing. So it's a dream team. I'm Christine Gunsaullus. I'm not only your moderator and senior project manager at Entech Engineering, I am also the storage tank queen. And for formal occasions, I always wear my crown. Yes, it's a crown. And what makes me the tank queen? That. Speaking of wise men, Ralph Warzinakowski, he is with Pennsylvania American Water, where he's an engineering project manager. I first met Ralph 4 years ago when he made a very wise statement. And he's responsible for maintaining hundreds of tanks throughout Pennsylvania. Speaking of wise guys, my colleague Rob Horvat is the regional director of Entech's Pittsburgh office. And in 4 short years that we've been working together, we've teamed up on dozens of tanks, rehabs, and new construction. So we love working together and sharing our knowledge and helping our clients. Speaking of wise, last month I was out on 5 different tank sites in Northeast Maryland with Neil Durstein. He's the owner of Durstein Company, and in the 3 hours we spent together, he practically gave us a master class on mixer installations and THM removal equipment, how to get it in and on the tank and how to best set it up. And later that day, I'm like, Neil, you got to be on my panel. You got to be here. You know so much that would help our clients. So that's why he's here. Andy Mumford, he's a dear tanky friend. He's the owner and vice president at MBA, also known as Mumford Bjorkman Associates. They're a tank inspection firm, and he used to be my boss. So he's always sharing cool stories and awesome pictures with me regarding tanks because he knows I'm just going to love them. And Andy is the one who recommended Tom Klein to join our group. He's a project engineer from AWWA, Pennsylvania. And the poor guy, he does 2 of the hardest things with tanks. He's in charge of the mixers and he's in charge of the cell carriers. And if you've ever dealt with cell carriers on tanks, you know they're a pain in the ass. So poor Tom, but he does it really, really well. And while I've only known him for about a week, we talked for about an hour last week, all about tanks, including many of the hundreds of tanks that he takes care of in Southeast Pennsylvania. So that's our panel. Before we get into questions, what I want to do is throw a poll out there to our audience. And this helps us to understand what your experience is. So the question I want to ask the audience is, what type of mixing are you familiar with? And you can pick as many as you want here from the list. Give you just 15 seconds, but pick out the different ones that you're familiar with. And the top ones are just sort of basic ones, the passive mixing system, active mixing. But then we get into different manufacturers like PAX, like Solar B and Grid B, and a newer one on the market, the Casco Certisafe. So this will give us sort of some guidance in, do you know the very basics of passive mixing is when water's just going into a pipe and moving through the tank. Active means there's something spinning around inside the tank, there's an active motor somewhere or something moving the water inside, and a little bit of a difference there. So I'll give you 2 more seconds to finish the poll, and then I will end the polling and share the results with everybody. So we have got, okay, so as far as the results go, looks like lots of people know what passive mixing is. I'm guessing it's because, well, that's been around the longest, at least seeing it in water tanks. I remember back in the early 90s seeing it in a few of the big reservoirs. Also active mixing, a fair amount of people know it. And then as far as the types of mixers, okay, Grid B, lots of people know that one, and the Solar B. Okay, excellent. So sounds like most people have some familiarity with this. So that's good. Okay, excellent. Okay, so as far as questions go, I always think the #1 question I get from tank owners is, how do I know if I need a mixer? How do I know if I need a mixer? And what I'd like to do is pose this question to the guys who own the tanks. So Ralph, you're my go-to guy. Can you share with us, how do you decide? Do you just throw a mixer in every tank, or how do you decide?
Yeah, so typically it starts with a frantic call from our operations side of the business about a chlorine residual or a taste and odor issue or a THM issue that we have in the business. Or if we're designing a new tank and we know it's going to be on an extended part of our distribution system where it either won't see much turnover or it won't see much use at first. We know, intuitively that mixing in that tank is going to be needed to keep our customers safe and keep our product consistent for its use.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Would you say, now, how many tanks are you in charge of throughout Pennsylvania?
Oh boy. Today it's 350. Tomorrow it could be more. We continue to acquire systems, much like Tom, I'm sure, and it's always a challenge. So managing that many assets across the state, you get to see a lot of different obstacles and a lot of different wins as well.
So is out of those 350 tanks, would you say like half of them have some either passive or active mixing, or you 25%? Give a sense of what percentage?
So I did a little background research after you and I talked yesterday. Since we first met in 2015, I think we've installed about 40 mixers just in that time frame. And we've also had probably about 6 or 7 new tank constructions that have mixers. So overall, I'd say we probably have about 60 in 350 tanks.
Okay. And I'm curious, as far as AWWA Pennsylvania goes, Tom, can you share your experience with how does AWWA decide which tanks get a mixer, which ones don't need them? How do you decide?
We have a water quality team who looks at historical data for chlorine residual, and we have a nitrification count and a chlorination scoreboard. And typically the tanks that have made the naughty list for a couple of years in a row, they get mixers. Anymore though, we're kind of, the default is to put a mixer in almost regardless of a mixer of some variety, whether it's passive or active. Just at least to have it in the event that we did need to chlorinate a tank. It's always better to have one there for operations than to have to scramble for one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. A comment did come in already. Pat Burke wants to know, how did Tom develop such great taste in sports teams, Flyers, and Penn State University? Let's go Flyers. Okay, continue.
Penn State, because I'm a Penn State grad. Flyers, because there is no better team.
Okay, so continuing with tank mixer questions. One question that I often, or a lot of owners aren't aware of this, and that is, do they need a permit, any type of permit for installing a tank mixer? Rob, I know you and I run into this an awful lot of times. So does the DEP require any sort of permits for these mixers?
Yeah, the answer is always yes when you ask the DEP if they require a permit. Yeah, in fact, the DEP, at least in our region, considers the addition of mixers to be a major permit amendment. So there is permitting involved with doing that. And typically, you know, if there's any question ever whether or not a permit is required, or even if you think you know the answer, it's always best to approach the DEP and ask that question just to confirm.
Yeah, and because actually I was with Ephrata Borough yesterday, talking with their operator and director about tanks and mixing. And like when we rehab a tank, if we're repainting the inside, I know we need a major permit, but when it comes to the mixers, I'm like, you check with the guys to find out, is it minor, is it major? Yeah, you're right, Rob. Typically,
yeah, usually if you're putting something in the tank, they consider it a major permanent amendment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But again,
so
it's not always consistent across the board. So it's always best to check with your local group to make sure you know what they're looking for.
Yeah, and also consider the time frame involved when you submit the paperwork for it and the check that they get. I mean, we could be looking at several months before we get that back, and you can't install it or turn it on until that happens. Is that right?
I usually assume it's going to take at least a quarter to get through the permitting process with the DEP. It's usually pretty safe.
I've actually recently started to bundle permit applications with the Southeast DEP regional office. They just usually ask that you take whatever mixers you're bundling and separate by PWS ID.
Okay.
Does this mean you only need one check for the whole thing? Like what? One
Yes.
check? That was, wait, was that a yes?
Yes.
Oh, so that is a way to save money if you've got multiple tanks. And I have heard of this. If you're planning on doing it like all within a calendar year, installation of mixers and a bunch of tanks, submit one permit, break it out by tank, and yeah, you can save some money and get it all reviewed at once. So that is a key thing to keep in mind. Rob?
Yeah, Christine, with it, I mean, just the project we're working on together now, the Beaver Falls project, they had the two coatings, and one of those tanks got a mixer. So we submitted a single major permit amendment to cover all 3 tasks.
Good point. Any other permit experience? Any other types of permits people should keep in mind when it comes to the mixers?
I would say from an installation standpoint, on the electrical, most times we have to get electrical permits to do that. Especially in the state of New Jersey, you're not gonna do anything over there without a permit on electrical, and you have to be licensed for sure. So I have found that to be kind of a tank by tank basis.
Okay, and that's something that the contractor would be responsible for getting?
Yeah, a lot of times we'll ask the owner too if they foresee the need to get a permit just to do an extension of if you're just doing 120 volt power mixer, it's not too bad. If you're doing an extensive electrical upgrade and all, then permits are a necessity.
Okay.
Not a big deal, but it's just part of the equation.
Okay, excellent. Any other permit comments? Okay, when we had that poll up from our audience, lots and lots of people were familiar with the passive mixing system. So that's piping running through the tank with valves to move the water through, and typically you're drawing out the bottom. Any of you guys still seeing passive mixing systems installed in tanks? I'll throw that over to you, Ralph. You still doing that in any of your tanks? And if so, how do you decide which ones get those?
Yeah, so typically when we're looking at installing a mixing system, we actually just looked at one in Northeast PA where our operations team felt safer to have the passive mixing in addition to the active mixing. So it's in a remote location. If the power were to go out or the line were to get damaged, or if we're installing a solar mixer and for some reason that panel gets hit with something, they wanted to just have a little bit more of a fail-safe to have that passive mixing. But what you have to realize with passive mixing is that you need additional tank turnover in order for that to work. And a lot of times the reason you're adding a mixer is because your tank turnover is low to begin with. So passive mixing isn't always the best option in a circumstance like that.
Yeah, that was something design. Well, sometimes remember that quote, mixing is still in its infancy. So we're still learning what works, what doesn't. And I remember a few years ago, Dan Preston, my friend up in North Penn Water, we were under the impression the passive mixing would work. You only had to cycle your tank maybe 10%, 20% the most. He was having to do it like 40%. Make sure you get a lot of water in and out to see full mixing. And he's like, I wasn't expecting that. So you live and learn. But you're right. So many of the tanks that need the mixers, like passive, it's almost like it's not quite enough, or just operations wise, you can't get that fluctuation going. So Rob, I know the tanks we did for Treasure Lake, those have both passive and active mixers.
Yeah, we actually ended up putting in the inlet outlet separator, so we were able to put the water flow into the tank, enters at the top of the tank, and then we draw off the bottom, which is a form of passive mixing, a simplified form of it, but still a form of it. And then we added active mixers as well to those 2 tanks.
And it was the same idea as what Ralph just said, where it's sort of like a backup plan that there's still some sort of mixing going on if there's a power outage.
Right.
Yeah. So. Okay. So Tom, I'm curious. What about over at AWWA? What do you guys end up seeing? Are you still installing both? And actually, when we were talking last week, you mentioned duplicity when it comes to your mixer. So first question, are you still doing passive mixing in any of your tanks?
I'd say about half of it. Anytime we take a tank down for painting, we evaluate whether or not we should do a passive mixer. I'd say we install them in about half of the painting projects. It all depends on the turnover. If the turnover is not there for it, somewhere around 40 or 50%, then we try to avoid it. It's actually kind of hard to emergency chlorinate a tank with an inlet outlet separator or riser pipe, or whatever you want to call them. It's actually proven quite difficult to avoid building up a slug of chlorine in the pipe if you don't have enough incoming system flow. So in that case, it's always been better for us to have active mixing, because you can immediately distribute the chemical, or if the power's off, you just don't chlorinate until the power's back.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Andy, I'm curious, you guys inspect what, hundreds of tanks every year. You go out and do the ROVs, the remotely operated vehicles. What, like when Kevin's out there and the reports that you're reviewing, what percentage of tanks at this point do you think have either passive or active mixing? Have we hit 50% yet, or is it still lower than that?
I would say we're still much lower than that. You know, as Ralph had mentioned, this is, you know, still in its infancy. So a lot of the tanks that we're going out to evaluate, you know, are, you know, because there's a need, or, you know, there's a suspicion of a need for repainting. So we're talking about coating systems in these tanks that are, you know, beyond a decade. So it's very few that we see the mixing systems in, but, you know, to Tom's point, and we're doing a lot of work with their tank painting projects. Yes, we're seeing a lot of mixing systems being installed in tanks that are being repainted, and also a lot in the new tanks that have been built within the last 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. So as far as the ones we're going out to evaluate, they've probably been coated, you know, earlier than 2010, we'll say, you know, and we're still seeing tanks that, you know, were coated back in the 90s. So we're not seeing many mixing systems in those tanks.
Okay. Okay. Neil, I'm curious, you get involved in installations of what, like 100 mixers a year, or I may be exaggerating, but dozens and dozens of mixers all over the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Delaware, Maryland area, maybe even further. How, when people come to you for the installation, do you have a sense of what their need is, or what has drawn them to realizing, oh my God, we need a mixer in our tank?
I never really spent a whole lot of time in that department. I usually work for somebody, so I pretty much focus on the installation part of it. And there's not enough feedback yet that we're getting from. I mean, even with Ralph, I mean, we install mixers for him. I don't really converse with Ralph on the finished product. It's just I'm not really involved in that part of it. But I would like to have more feedback to know that when you have different mixer manufacturers, who has maybe a better mixer for a specific tank. You know, there's pros and cons to every machine that's out there, but no, from a feedback standpoint, I talk to the owners mostly on location and the maintenance of them down the road, what they should be doing to manage them and to keep an eye on the production of them and all that. That's about the extent of it at the moment.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think as we do more, as we're involved in it more, I think we'll probably get more knowledge of the sweet spots of these mixers and what you can do to give that info to the owner based on experience. For sure.
Yeah, you just reminded me about, I guess it was probably right when Ralph and I did the mixer panel together. All I could think was, there's all these different types of mixers. They're passive, they're active, and well, what's the website? What's the pros? What's the cons? How much does it cost to install one? Where should we use it? I put together a mixing matrix table, an Excel spreadsheet with links to the manufacturers, and I usually update it every year. I'm going to send it out to this panel. You guys are so smart. And of course the manufacturers to get some new feedback, but I want to update it, and that's where we can sort of get a sense of where each mixer, where's its sweet spot? Where's the best place to use each of them? And I'd love your input. So that's something, as I said, it's already available on our website, but we'll be doing an update based on your expertise, because I'd love sharing this with the clients, because just 2 weeks ago, I got 2 emails in a day with guys who are like, can you help us with a mixer? We want you to install one. I'm like, we don't sell mixers. Start here. Start with this mixer matrix. Tells you all the manufacturers. It's got pros and cons. It'll give you a sense of what you're dealing with. Because you've never dealt with it. It's sort of crazy with all the different options, and everyone's telling you, hey, this one's going to work the best. Ralph?
Yeah. So a couple things here. one, we have a couple questions that came in, and we'll get to them after this. But Neil, typically, if you're not getting feedback from an owner, that's a good thing. You'll usually get a call if something broke or something isn't working.
That is so right.
Yeah.
No news is usually good news.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I operate too.
I just know with our installation crew, whenever it's a route tank, it's usually in the middle of nowhere and you need an all-terrain vehicle to get in.
Yeah, that's pretty safe.
It's good to know your clients. So yeah, Ralph is correct. So we've got a question from Art Achenbach. He says, in line with Neil's electrical comments, for mixing systems that require electrical service into the tank, so motor-powered mechanical mixers, are there special electrical requirements or NSF-rated cable requirements? And also, are there so I guess we'll pose that question first to Neil or any of the tank owners. So any special electrical requirements or NSF-rated cable requirements? Neil, do you know?
The manufacturers supply NSF-approved cable in the wet area from the motor to the top of the tank. And then we take it from there, and we use my son's an electrician, the company, but we use the whatever the wire is that's for moisture, stranded copper wire, whatever they call it. It's the X-rated or whatever.
Okay.
If you have, there's a couple of different things. If you don't have any power at the site at all, or power is from a distance, which we experience a lot, there's all different types of environments and codes that you have to follow. Some of the tanks I've done for Ralph, we actually had to bring new service into the tank from the nearest power source. So that requires permitting and working with the power company and all that. So that's all a code requirement that we have to follow for that. But once you get to the tank and you're in the vicinity of the tank and going up the shell, it's your standard basic electrical practice that you follow to the NEC code. But again, with anything that's in the water, that has to be NSF approved to go into that water. So we have to literally put whatever the manufacturers supply with their machines goes in the water, whether it's the tether cables, the power cables, everything that's already a done deal through the manufacturing process of being approved to be NSF. So yeah, the wiring on the inside of the tank is strictly bought from the mixer company.
Okay. And yes, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, actually, interesting story. When they first started bringing these floating aerators into the market for drinking water applications, that was a big part of the holdup. People were interested in trying to use these things, but the NSF rating on the cable itself was something that was difficult for some of these manufacturers to get. Most of the wetted components, most of it's stainless steel, and it's easy to get NSF. But when you start getting into the cabling, it was really complicated for them to get those approvals. So again, a lot of these floating aerator applications came from the wastewater side where they didn't need NSF. So when they were trying to make this change from dirty water to clean water, that was a big part of the holdup in getting those products developed.
Right.
Actually, you just reminded me, sometimes mixers, when they go from wastewater to potable water, I know I struggled with you, Rob, 4 years ago, trying to get the bubbler system. How do we, if we install it in a tank, well, what are the brackets we use? What are they made of? Are they painted? What's the materials? And when I'm talking to the manufacturer, he's like, well, I don't know what they use inside the tank. I just, use whatever. I'm like, no. NSF approval. Do you know about that? Well, no, not really.
Right.
Same with new mixer manufacturers who've never done potable water. I read through a sample spec from one recently, and I get to the end, I'm like, oh, they just drop it in the water and start running it? Like, what about spray disinfecting anything that goes in the tank beforehand if it's a tank that's in service? And they're like, oh, yeah, we should really add that to our spec. That's a good idea. Mixer is still in its infancy, and a part of me is like, oh my God, how can you sell something if you don't know what you're doing? But we'll all work together and teach each other, and try to keep the clients and their tanks and water safe. So I think that covers the electrical part. So
quick note on NSF stuff, actually.
What was that, Tom?
Just a quick note on NSF stuff. Now I only know how this pertains to Pennsylvania, because every state is different on NSF requirements. But in the state of Pennsylvania, your components for public water system don't actually have to be explicitly stamped by the NSF, but they still need to be Safe Drinking Water Act and NSF 61 compliant. And you need to make a case to the DEP. So you need to provide them with a material list and wetted surface areas and everything that that prove that it is compliant. And if you submit that to the DEP and make an argument, then you can use those components even if they don't explicitly carry the listing.
Okay. Sounds like you've done this before.
Yes.
That's excellent, and good to know, and important for owners, engineers to be aware of this and know, okay, there is a way to do it. So excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Any other comments on the DEP requirements, NSF, when it comes to the mixers?
It varies by regional office for the most part. I've had pretty good luck in the Southeast PA office with the group of guys there. But it'll definitely depend on what part of the state you're in.
Ralph, what were you going to say?
I'm going to mimic Tom's comments. Having tanks all across the state, sometimes a tank mixer is a major permit, sometimes it's a minor permit. And when we spoke 5 years ago, there were some sections that didn't require a permit at all for tank mixers. So,
I remember that, yeah.
It's developed itself through DEP as well, and I think they're still learning what to do, but some sections call it part of a treatment process, so it's considered a major permit, and some consider it more like a tank rehab where it's a minor permit. And again, that's all changing with the new DEP fees and guidelines as well. So I would suspect that it'll change further as we go forward.
Maybe that clears up the confusion on our part, because we have like 3 different scenarios. 1, turn it on as soon as you have it installed. 2, don't turn it on until we get the DEP sign off. And 3, we may need to get a DEP permit. We're not sure yet, but turn it on anyhow. So we didn't really know if that's up to a owner by owner case, but this is making sense. It's I guess the region that it's in.
So Neil, what I've seen recently is what DEP prefers is for us to isolate the tank or take the tank out of service and then install a mixer and then get at least a back T sample and send it to them. And then they'll approve the permit and operation of the permit. So, that construction permit, at least from what I've seen lately in the 6 districts, is that's what they want.
Okay. I think early on we had the DEP actually came out to the site. They want to actually watch the installation of a mixer for their own, acquiring their own knowledge on the process of it. So that was a very interesting day working with them and answering their questions and all. I mean, it was a good day. It was just different.
Yeah.
They're very thorough. They don't miss anything. They ask questions that a contractor has trouble answering.
Mm-hmm.
If I had you there, Christine, it would have been easy, but I just kind of answered what I could. Their big concern was, are you chlorinating the equipment before you insert it into the water? And what method are you using, and what is your ratio of chlorine?
Yep. Well, and I learned that very well from working with Andy at MBA, because they're every day dropping their ROV into a tank, and 200 parts per million spray solution. You got to get it on the ROV before you drop it in, or their divers going in. So, but Neil, you're also reminding me when a new mixer enters the market, and DEP, whoever's reviewing the permit, if they're not familiar with that particular mixer, often they're very cautious and they don't want to make a mistake or have a problem. So if there's any way to show them, oh, it's been installed in Pennsylvania here successfully, that's a way you can calm their.
Well, I tried that in New Jersey. I'm like, yeah, we do a lot of these in Pennsylvania. I'm like, well, you're not in Pennsylvania.
So that doesn't work there.
So, but yeah, the two major players in the mixer market, I mean, they went pretty much the easy path. Both of their motors are by Franklin, which they've been around forever, and they're in everybody's well behind your house. They've been around forever. They're well pumps, well motors and well pumps. So I think that that's already in potable water for a long time. So they kind of took those motors and incorporated. One put a boat prop on it, another one put a different type of whatever. But that hard work's already been done.
Okay, excellent. And one last question with the DEP, NSF, AWWA. As far as AWWA goes, there is no standard for mixers that I know of. Am I missing something? Anyone know of any? Rob?
I'm not aware of one.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll have to talk to people who write this, or is anyone involved in any of the committees for writing the standards for AWWA here?
I am, and I'm not aware of anything for tank mixing yet. I'll bring that up at our next meeting and see if the minds that be know any more than I do.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
That was a question that I had in regards to that, and I've been thinking about this for a while. Like with anything that's new, you know, you go gung-ho into it and you just do a bunch of stuff and you get them in or whatever. Do regulations then, after it's been in a system for a while, do regulations tend to follow? Like they start putting laws out either from DEP or AWWA. We don't want this done anymore. We have to follow this procedure. And do you see that coming? Do you see that as a potential down the road that, you know, a simple mixer installation we're doing now could be a little more complex later as regulations follow behind it?
It's changed in the last 5 years, so I would be surprised if it didn't change going forward.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, we could look at the AWWA standard for composite tanks. They were building them down in Texas in the 80s. And then through the 90s, they were talking about getting the new, was it D107? I forget what it is, but talking about it. And for 30 years, 40 years. And finally, it was released like 2015, standard for composite tanks. I'm like, woohoo, finally. And finally, there only been, you know, hundreds, thousands built all throughout the country. So yeah, sooner or later, I'd say there would be one for the AWWA. Another question from our audience. So this is from Doug Berg, and he asks, how effective is mixing in preventing ice formation in cold climate locations? So Ralph, you deal with the tanks all over Pennsylvania in the northern part of the state where we see freezing during the winter. Which type of mixing works best for that? Does it stop ice formation?
Yeah, so we've had struggles with passive mixing, stopping ice formation, especially in taller standpipe tanks that may be very thin and very tall. We've had a lot of struggles with that. When we get into active mixing, as long as the mixer's doing its job, we seem to see very little ice formation, which I'm looking at the next question that came in regarding temperature probes, and it kind of delves into that. That's how we verify these mixtures are keeping our water fully mixed. Neil and I have installed, I don't know, probably 20 mixers over the last 3 years, and almost every time we ask him to also install temperature probes that go into the tank, and they're set at certain levels, so 20%, 40%, 60, 80% of the tank volume total going up the column of water. And that gives us a sense of if the temperature is the same at each level, then so is the chlorine, and so is, you know, any other product that's in the water. It should technically be fully mixed. So that's what we use as kind of a napkin check to see, okay, this is working correctly. And again, in tanks that the temperature is the same, you know, you don't have any ice formation.
So Ralph, you do that as a permanent installation after you put your mixers in?
We do, yeah. We have been, I'll say, over the last 2 years or so. And what it does is on the mixer panel where you turn on and off outside of the tank, it has a set of temperatures, then either 3 or 5 temperatures that you can see there in the field. And what we're working to do now is tie that into our SCADA system. So at the treatment plant, our operators can see, 1, the mixer is working, and 2, you know, what the temperatures are at the different levels. Sorry, Christine, I know we got a little off topic there.
No, this is perfect because Doug Berg is designing some tanks for you guys right now in the Northeast where you're like, hey, I want temperature probes in them. And it's because you and Neil have done this already. So they're permanent probes. And so they give you feedback immediately. It's not like you have to pull there's some probes you drop in the water, you leave them there for a couple of weeks, and then you pull them out and you get all the data. But these are instantaneously getting recordings. And like in my mind, a question that came up yesterday, once again, when I was at EFRTA, they're like, hey, how do we know if the mixer's actually working? And we always laugh. We're like, well, because the little green light's blinking. The green light's blinking at the top of the ladder. So yes, we know the mixer's working. And I say, no, you have no way. All we know is the green light's blinking. You don't know if it's really mixing the water. So your temperature probes, that's your proof, wouldn't you say, that your mixer is working, Ralph?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions with multiple tank mixer companies, Tank Shark, PAX, GridBee, SolarBee, and they all have the data to back that up that shows that if the temperature is the same, you're thoroughly mixed in the tank. So I would pass the buck to Neil and say anybody looking for more information on the temperature probes themselves, reach out to him directly and see which ones he's using and maybe his supplier, or have him install them. It seems to be fairly effective for us. And I will say when we first installed them, there were some hiccups where the probes weren't working correctly and things didn't work out the way they should. But that's with any new technology you're using, right? It's our first set of temperature probes we're using out of tank. I didn't expect it to go flawlessly.
But it just gets better and better each time. Andy, what are you seeing?
Sorry, I was had my cursor too far from the mute button. No, when you were talking about is the mixing system working or not, I recently had a question that was brought to us, and we get questions daily, and 99.9% of them we answer because we see it. But I have a client over in New Jersey that asked, has anybody ever installed a camera in their tank watching the water to confirm that the water is mixing? And I was like, you're the first person to ever, have that request out of our, all the clients that we serve in the Mid-Atlantic. First time I heard that. So I reached out to Allied Control Systems, and they're currently working on a solution. So we're going to present it, we're going to price it up, and yeah, maybe there's an opportunity for putting a camera, like we have our, new security cameras in our homes and businesses. He wanted to be able to, this was a client that has a hydro pillar. And he wanted to be able to, not only walk up to the control box and check to see the blinking light, but also to, look on a monitor to see, yep, my water is churning.
Oh, but you'd need a light too, right? Because the inside of a tank is dark unless the roof hatches are open, right?
Correct. It gets pretty dark in there. So yeah, but you would need a light, or, these infrared cameras are doing a pretty decent job with their night vision technology.
Oh, wow, cool. And that's one of the things I love about our industry, where the technology's out there, like drones. Now we're using them more and more for construction, for inspection. So same deal with what we can put in the tanks.
The control panels from all the mixing companies are built SCADA ready also. So they if they have access to their SCADA, they can have 100% monitoring of, I don't know if they can monitor the amp draw of the motor, but they can certainly see if it's running or not through their SCADA package. Speaking on the ice thing, we did a unique one for aqua water up in the Poconos a couple years ago. I don't think it was Tom's crew. I think it was the Northern Aqua guys. And I think it was at the Wolf Creek Lodge or something up there where they have a lot of activity in the summertime. At wintertime, it goes pretty dead. And they had a sort of a small, I think the tank was only 16 feet in diameter, and it was a standpipe, and it just froze. It just froze something terrible every year, kind of like up on the mountain. So we built a temperature probe control panel. I had a local UL listed panel builder build it for me, and we designed it to be SCADA ready, and it had a function in it that we could put a tank heater in the tank, and we suspended that. I think it was suspended at 6 feet off the floor. And then the mixer was underneath of that, shooting the water up to the surface. And then the temp probes controlled when the heater would turn off and on based on water temperature. So that was like a once and done unique situation that we've done. I don't think there's much need for it because most tanks utilize water pretty consistently year round, but this was just one of those deals where it's like a summer type environment. So that was kind of unique. That's how they dealt with the ice up there. And I think they had aerated it years ago, just aerated the surface, and that didn't really do the trick when it got really cold. So I'm not sure. I got feedback from it in the past, but I'm not sure where it stands now, but it seemed to have solved some of the problems of ice.
Yeah, because back in the day when I used to build tanks, there was bubbler systems that we'd install where it was plastic tubing run around the bottom perimeter inside the tank and then up the shell and down the shell, and there'd be air pumped through it, and little bubbles would come out, and just little bubbles were reportedly able to stop freezing. And I know American Water had tons of those, but over the years they stopped working. You can just pull them out when you rehab the tanks. Ralph, do you still have any of those bubbler systems in any of your tanks?
Oh, I remember removing one 3 or 4 years ago. The cost of that equipment has become prohibitive to replace when compared to installing a newer active mixing system. So we've found that even in our largest tanks, I mean, we have a 7.2 million gallon tank out here in Pittsburgh, and we installed 2 active mixers in it, and it's been great. I don't want to say perfect ever since, but it's been great ever since. And you know, at that volume of water, you would need a huge compressor to push enough air through to get that water moving. So, yeah, we just found it cost prohibitive to keep up with the maintenance of those.
Okay. Okay, another question from our audience. This is, I don't think we touched on this with the temperature monitoring, but is it required to ensure adequate mixing? And if so, to what level? Like the nearest degree Fahrenheit or 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit? Neil and Ralph, or I guess Neil, your temperature probes, is it to the nearest degree, or what do you install as far as the probes go?
We have a pretty complex temporary. I'm not even sure how it works, Steve. Is it Wi-Fi or is it all? It's just backed up by power.
No, it's all out here.
We'll set it, and we did 2 for AWWA out in Pittsburgh last year, because I think Entech might have been the engineer, and you guys like to see a 2-week test of the mixing after the mixer's installed. So rather than us send a guy out there every day to take readings, we bought this, whatever the gizmo is. You just has everything on it. You drop it in, and then you bring it back, and my daughter downloads it on her computer and spits out this big spread. It's way past what I can understand in computers, but it's pretty amazing. That broke it down into like gazillionths of a degree. But when we do a permanent install, if we can get it within 1 degree at 5 different levels, that's kind of what we're shooting for. That's what I think most engineers and owners are happy with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have any, Neil, any sort of sense of materials and installation to install these temperature probes? Are we talking like $10,000, $20,000? Any feel for materials?
The equipment with the panel and the probes is about $5,000, I believe, in cost just for the equipment. And then depending on it always depends on the tank, obviously the height of it and where it's located in the area. But yeah, I think an average $10,000 to $5,000 cost of materials. I think 10 to 12 total installed at most tanks is kind of a fair assumption on the overall cost of it. We did one for Ralph, I think a couple weeks ago, that had about 150-foot run that we had to pull cable to his nearest, I guess, SCADA center that he would be able to tie into. Other ones are further, but most water tanks have some kind of facility fairly close to them that you don't have to go too far with your power cords once you come out of the tank. But it is work. I mean, it's actually probably more work than actually installing the mixer. Because you have there's a tether weight that's included. There's a cable chain that we designed that has the probes at different elevations. You have to kind of measure the tank before you install them and make sure you have the probe set at the elevations that you want. Then you have to penetrate through the roof. And we've used the Madura's design with their brass seal penetration. We use that to bring the temp probes through, which is a really slick fitting. Doesn't require, it requires like a 1-inch hole drilled. And then you got to run your conduit from the roof tank down to the ground, and wherever the owner wants to go from there. Sometimes we have to trench it. So I mean, there's a lot of variables in it as to where the owner wants their cables landed. With Ralph, he usually wants them in the nearest building, and then his people take it from there. We just get the signal wires into them. Other ones want a full-fledged control panel included, mounted in the building, SCADA ready, so they can have it local, but they can also tie it to remote later if they want to.
Okay,
so
excellent.
Those costs can go up pretty quick if it starts getting 160-foot high tank and you got to go 300 feet to the nearest operation building. Obviously, you're not going to do that for $12,000, but
yeah. I'm seeing like more and more owners are realizing data's
they
power.
love it. The more data, the better. The more they can look at their laptop, they love it. We can't get enough of it.
As an engineer, it helps us to know, well, is it working? Isn't it? You can compare it to other tanks and just better understand what's going on inside these
Well, if
things.
you have tanks all over the place, they're in woods, and each entrance has a gate, and they're all over the place. As an operator, I wouldn't want to be going back into them things more than I have to either. I'd like to have them on my laptop sitting next to me so I can see what's going on. I understand why they do it, for sure.
Okay, before we move on to the next question, I have something very special we're going to do right now, and that is a lightning round. Yeah, this is fun. So what we're going to do is I'm going to throw a question out to my panel, and in 30 seconds or less, tell us about the worst mixer fail you've ever seen, and whether it's happened on your watch or it was you heard the story. And I'll start off by talking about 10 years ago or so. There were some mixers installed in New Jersey, and I know they routed the cable, the electrical cable for the mixer through the shell. They drained the tank, rehabbed it, put the active mixer inside, routed the cable through the shell, turned it on. Wintertime comes, ice, snow is on the roof, crashes down, and it cuts the cable. And then water starts coming out of the tank. And they're like, shit, what are we going to do? Like, the only way to remove that mixer and fix the cable, drain the tank, take it offline, replace the mixer, replace the cable. They did that. I believe the next winter, ice and snow forms on the roof and crashes down and cuts the cable again. And they're like, okay, so lesson learned to everyone, don't run the cables through the shell. While it's a pain in the ass running it up the shell and through the roof hatch, you can remove the mixer later, and mixer motors burn out over time. So lesson learned, always go through the roof hatch or some way to get mixer in and out later. Okay, Rob, 30 seconds or less, worst mixer fail you've heard of.
This was a former client of mine.
When
I was with my former employer, we had installed tanks or mixers, active mixers in tanks while they were still online. So lowered them in, started them up, and these ones actually had spray aerators in at the time. About 2 days later, spray aerator started to fail. We couldn't figure out why. Took them down and realized that at some point in the history of that tank, there had been a ladybug infestation. So putting a active mixer in the bottom of that tank and stirring it up pushed all of that into the suction of the spray aerator and completely destroyed the equipment in a very short period of time. Neil, that actually may have been one of your installs, if I remember correctly. I can't remember if it was you guys or it was the factory crew, but yeah, completely destroyed the equipment in very short order. So lesson learned, I never put a mixer in a tank anymore without either a really, really thorough inspection or having somebody clean it or empty it first.
Okay, excellent. Andy, worst mixer fail, 30 seconds or less.
Brand new tank, Aberdeen, Maryland, active mixer installed on mounted to a bracket that was fabricated in the shop. Tank painted, put into service. Operators come to check on the tank one day, and it sounds like there's a jackhammer up in the tank, just going berserk. In that case, the active mixer that was mounted to the bracket that was welded to the tank, the bracket wasn't designed, or the fastener wasn't designed to absorb the slight vibration of the active mixing system, so it came undone. The mixer came undone, remained active in spite of the fact that it was spinning around and jackhammering the tank. And nobody knows how long it had lasted in that case until they were able to shut the power off. But once they did, needless to say, there was significant damage, only to the coating, not to the metal itself, but significant damage to the point they had to drain the tank back down, go in and repaint the base of this tank.
Okay, excellent. Okay, next, Tom, give us your worst mixer story, worst fail in 30 seconds or less.
When we did our project at Newtown Tank, we realized after several repeated failures of the PAX mixers we installed, the horizontal tripod assembly is not suitable for epoxy coated floors. It's much better for concrete floors. So similar to Andy's story, vibrations caused the mixer to walk across the tank until it reached the end of its power cord where it would tilt over and chew up the paint. One of them actually gouged the tank floor rather significantly. And after that, epoxy floors, all vertical tripod assemblies.
Live and learn. Okay, Neil, give us your worst mixer fail in 30 seconds or less.
Well, that's the same story since I'm the guy that installed them for Tom. I mean, I felt bad about it, but I didn't design the mixer. I just installed it as per manufacturer's specifications. But the good thing that came out of it was, and that's kind of how I've always run my company, is try and always benefit from something that has gone bad, because it can save a lot of time and money and even endangering people's health and lives later. I mean, any knowledge you can get out of a bad situation, you got to go for it. So I really worked that manufacturer over pretty hard. Like, this is a simple situation. I mean, you just got to have some kind of counterweights on your legs so you can, first of all, a lot of your bigger tanks like Tom's, those floor panels are really up and down. When you walk on them, they're springing up and down, and so it's not a nice level surface to set them on in the first place. And then when you're pushing mostly horizontal, you got force behind it. But we have a couple that we're installing in the next couple of weeks, very similar to that, and I just insisted with them, like, we're going to put counterweights on these legs every one we do from this point on. And it seems to have solved the problem. We've done quite a few since Tom's situation, and we haven't had any callbacks on them since that. But I'm like, you guys, you really should listen to the feedback from the installers and the owners, because that's how you can get your design better for certain environments later that will, solve those problems. So I really had to beat them up pretty good. Like, look, if you guys ain't going to put them on, I'll do it. It's just stainless steel companion flanges that you slip over the legs, and it gives them an additional weight to keep them down. And so they agree with us. So now every time they send me a mixer to install, surprisingly, it has the weights in the box. So apparently it works.
Excellent.
I think that's my worst. It was more embarrassing with working with AWWA than anything. It was just like, this is bull crap, man. This is coming from the great state of California. They should know how to make mixers out there, and these things are like falling over like 2 weeks in. So once we got that figured out, it seems to be okay.
I'm thrilled, because now everyone in our audience knows they've learned this lesson now, and we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on our website. So future generations will never have that problem as well.
Well, when you have the owner say, have you ever had this happen to you before? And you're like, no. You just, it's like, you don't want to have to, let's fix this thing now and move forward. So they have. The manufacturer got on top of it, and I believe they have solved that problem. So I'm not here to put a bad plug at them. They dealt with it. So I feel their mixers are just fine.
Excellent. Okay, and last person. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
One of the other takeaways from Newtown was to epoxy the feet onto the tripods of the PAX mixers, because every time it tilted over, the feet popped off.
Ooh.
Or every time we take it out of the tank, the feet popped off. Every time we had the divers in there, they chucked more old feet out at me that came off during the installations. I have them on my desk. They're pencil holders now.
Wait, so how do you secure them on the bottom of the legs?
Just some NSF epoxy before they go on. They just cup the tripod.
Okay, got it. Now we all know. Okay, and last person for our lightning round. Ralph, 30 seconds or less. Give us your worst mixer fail.
Boy, we've had a couple dead mixers over the years, which it's funny to look at now, but in the moment, it's sad. We've had a tripod mixer that failed essentially by hanging itself before they put a gate over top of the impeller. It got a hold of the wire in the chain that we lowered it down in, and it got caught in that. And of course it stopped working because it got all wound up. But to pick on the other guys as well, we've had a few of their floating mixers that stopped working, and then the ice accumulated in the tank. And then when the ice thawed, it essentially broke the mixer into pieces. So it was sad when we got the next ROV inspection of the tank, and there are just floating mixer pieces that it looks like a Star Wars scene in there. So it's interesting. It's not just one mixer that can fail, it's any of them. And then of course you go back to the age old, if you're not turning over a tank, your mixer's never going to work anyway. So your residual is still going to be low at the end of the season. So just, there's always learning experiences, maybe never failures, but always learning experiences.
Oh, yeah, I could rephrase that. You're right. Okay, excellent. Thank you, panelists, for, the lightning round. Love learning from you guys, so we can make sure our audience learns as well and they never have this happen. Going back to the Q&A from our audience, this is a question from my former colleague, Fred Bruinen with Fisher Tank. So with the current mixing systems available, are you able to consider the use of a standpipe in lieu of an elevated tank that may cost more to construct and then still be able to maintain the water quality with that excess water being stored in the standpipe? So I know Fisher struggles because they don't do elevated tanks. They can only do flat bottom tanks, but owners are realizing, shit, we don't want to have to be mixing and taking care of water quality for a million gallons. We just want to take care of like 20,000 gallons up at a height. But have you guys been able to still keep standpipes and big tall tanks in service by now using mixers and perhaps injecting chemicals? Ralph, what have you been seeing as far as that? Or are you tearing down all your standpipes and only putting in elevators? What are you doing?
My preference would be to put in elevated just so we could use the entire volume of water. However, we have certain areas that either already has a standpipe and we need a sister tank next to it so we can rehab the first tank, or other constraints, whether it be elevations or things like that. And we're still using standpipes and ground storage tanks. Obviously, any mixer is going to have a cost associated with it, an operating cost. And then if we're adding chemicals on top of that, that would be an additional operating cost. So if we could build something with a capital cost, it's usually less expensive for our customers, and it's a better product, in the end from we don't have to deal with as many moving parts there on site. However, again, it's a case-by-case basis, and we're still using all types of tanks. I don't want to say that we're not using ground storage tanks because that would be a fib.
I was going to ask Rob, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to remember in all this is we're talking about mixers. Mixers are going to, the point of a mixer is maintain a consistent water quality throughout your tank. So you don't have a slug of bad water in the tank. It maintains a consistency throughout the entire water column, throughout all the water you're storing. The challenge with a standpipe in some instances is the fact that you still have unused volume, or you have more volume for the same usable volume, I guess is the best way to put it. So water age, it still becomes more of a concern when you're talking about a standpipe versus an elevated tank. When it comes to the application of a mixer, absolutely, you're going to have a consistent water quality throughout the tank, regardless of the configuration of the tank, if a mixture is properly applied. Again, though, with the disinfection residual concerns we're having now, I echo what Ralph's saying too. I mean, if you can put in an elevated tank, just from that perspective, to try, especially if you're reaching a far ways out, having excess storage in the form of unusable storage in say the bottom of a tall standpipe is something that becomes a challenge operationally.
Tom, any sense of what AWWA's been doing as far as building new tanks? Or Andy, I know you get involved in the inspection of the new ones. Is mainly elevateds being built, or does it vary?
Still varies on a case-by-case basis, largely dependent on what area we're serving with the tank and what additional fire flow requirements we need to have. But the preference has been to do elevated bowls wherever we can, and that's our first choice. And then we kind of go down the list on what the next best available would be for a given location.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, once again, my client, North Penn Water Authority. They, for years, had like one elevated tank. And of the 1, 2, 3, well, I was just up there Monday, and they were lifting, Caldwell's out there with the bowl, lifting it atop the stem. Oh my God, it was so much fun. I love tank construction. But the last 3 tanks they built, they're all elevated. And granted, they've got a couple ground level. They're thinking of putting in some new developments, but they're really liking the elevateds for just realizing, okay, that really helps. Gravity can feed the system, and we're limiting the amount of dead storage that they would get otherwise from the standpipe. So interesting trend that I've been seeing over the years, where years ago you just build big and standpipes, reservoirs, they're all fine, but it's a new world. Water quality is really changing all this, and mixing can only help with certain things. Like mixing doesn't really help with water quality. Well, sometimes, all depends. Really, you got to make sure you understand your system and what's going on. So any other comments on that? Okay, one more question that had come in. It's a funny question, sort of directed to you, Andy. Are there NSF approved cameras? So as tying in with, is my mixer running and can you stick a camera in the water? So I guess that's something you'd have to be, or whoever's looking into this for you guys, that would be a concern. Make sure it is NSF approved, right?
Yeah, good question. I'm not aware of NSF approved cameras. In this instance, the camera would be above the high water line though. It would be, in the vapor zone.
Oh, so in my mind, I was like, oh, if the mixer is down on the ground, your camera would be underwater and looking at the mixer. So wait, so what?
No, this client wanted to have like a, flip a switch, look from the monitor and see the actual water churning, not the mixer itself.
Well, with these active mixers, do you always see water churning on the surface, or does it depend on the depth? What do you see when you guys go in there?
I mean, tanks that we inspected have active mixers that are, working. Yes, you see a churning of the water. I wouldn't say like it's not creating waves or anything, but you can definitely see the churning and the disturbance on the surface of the water.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
I think Andy needs to be a little careful with the camera thing, because they might not need tank inspectors in the future if there's cameras that are doing the job already.
As long as there's people that still, do not volunteer to climb tanks, I think I'll always have an occupation.
There you go.
I'll climb them safely. Let's add that.
Yes.
I know there's some tank owners out there. I'm like, so you got your harness and you're tied off, and they're like, oh wait, I have my safety belt. Dumbass. Okay, another question came in. This is from Kevin Gallagher. So understanding each tank is unique, what have you all seen with respect to changes in demand during the pandemic, temporary or permanent shifts, and what's the resulting impacts on water quality and mixing? So any changes? And my guess is, or yeah, go ahead, Val.
So in Pennsylvania right now, at least in Western Pennsylvania, we have had maybe 3 days of rain in the last, 6 months or so. I'm sure Rob can attest to that. And my garden out back is doing terrible this year, personally, but our water purchase is up almost across all of our systems, even though we've asked our customers to try to conserve water where possible. People are watering their lawns, people are doing things at home. So if anything, most of our residential consumption is up because people are at home more, people are flushing their own toilets more rather than their business. So our business consumption may be down, but our residential consumption is up. And then another caveat to that is I have a friend that works for Coca-Cola, and when they produce a bottle of Coca-Cola, they always want every single bottle to taste the same. Because when you order something, you want it to taste like you remember it to taste. So I've always used that kind of theory when we're installing a tank mixer, in that we want every drop of water to be the same for our customers. We want the pressure to stay the same. We want the water quality to be at or above every standard that's available. And I think these mixers are imparting and helping some of those results. So I think our demand has stayed pretty constant throughout the pandemic. Just because, we're a water company. You can't really live without it.
Yeah, good point.
I'll add a little bit of a butterfly effect discussion to that. Again, I think you're overstating how much rain we've had. It's one of the systems I work with, their surface water plant. Their raw water coming in off the river right now is 82 degrees. So
Oh.
maintaining disinfection residual in the system and everything else, they're flushing constantly, trying to maintain water quality and maintain compliance right now. So again, in addition to the customer demand, they're having to pump incredibly hard just to try to keep up with the demand they need to get the turnover they need to try to stay in compliance.
I feel for you guys. We've got mosquitoes all over the place because all it does is keep raining here. We had 5 inches of rain one day. We had 6 inches of rain one day. So oh my God, I guess we're both suffering. Tom, as far as AWWA goes, and you have any sense of any changes with COVID-19 and how your system's running and mixing and that sort of thing?
The water quality hotspots team's actually been keeping a pretty nice heat map that tracks the differences in flows between our residential areas and our industrial areas. And the industrial areas down and our residential consumption is up, much like Ralph had said. And it's actually kind of helped out some of our tanks in some of our areas that we would ordinarily have to flush at this time of the year, because the consumption is actually where it should be for a given tank. And so we've ended up kind of benefiting a little bit from the extra people working from home.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, I was with a client earlier this week, and I was like, how is stuff for you guys? And seeing the same sort of thing. Industry's down, but residential's up. And he's like, we're fine financially. Even though we can't shut off water service and collect on some of them, we're still doing okay financially. So at least it seems like the medium size and larger utilities are doing okay. Smaller guys, I'm not sure about, and I feel for them. So I guess over time we'll see. So back to, or once again, any audience members, you're still welcome to submit questions. See, we're coming up on 3:10 right now, so we got a few more minutes and then we'll wrap things up. Question I wanted to pose to Rob. There's a special type of tank mixing system that I had heard rumors about, and it wasn't until you came on board with Entech that finally we had someone with the experience of the pulse air, the PHI, the bubbler system. So you're essentially running stainless steel piping, like 1-inch diameter, into the tank. The piping pipes air into the tank, and there's these plates, these round plates, and a bubble forms at the base of the plate and goes, and the bubble rises up through the water. And I was like, there's no way in hell this thing can completely mix a water tank. But Rob, what's your experience been with this type of system?
Well, that was actually introduced to me or pointed out to me by one of my former client that I used to work with in Moon Township Municipal Authority out here. And John is quite the particular client to work for. And he loved these things. He loved the fact that there were no moving parts. It was active mixing, but everything was external from the tank. All the moving parts were external to the tank. The only thing you had inside the tank was essentially stainless steel. They actually installed these on their own. They had enough internal capacity to do it. But basically, you run an air line up the side of the tank, through the sidewall above the water line, back down inside. Depending on the geometry of the tank, it decides how many plates you need. These forming plates. The forming plates are probably 8-9 inches in diameter. Airline comes into the top of them. And then you have a compressed air source outside, which goes through a filter, moisture removal system. And then the control panel has a little pulse system in it that essentially creates this pulse of air, feeds the air to the forming plate at some frequency and duration, and then it releases basically the idea of having a beach ball size bubble of air inside your tank, and just the action of that air pocket moving up through the water column creates the mixing action. They work incredibly well. One of the two caveats: number one, you have to have the tank off, obviously, to completely out of service for a while to do it. And the other thing is, it's helpful if you have some place to put a compressed air source. So we've built a couple buildings to hold these things. Obviously, that drives the cost north pretty fast. But if you have a tank next to a booster station or something like that, they're really, really, really becomes a cost-effective option. So, and they work very well. It's crazy. I never thought about the impact on noise though, and we have actually had some neighbors like, what is going on in that tank? You know, it's every so often it'll go off, and they're like, what is that? So they can hear it from their house, and they're not used to ever hearing anything before. The tank never made noise before, and now it makes this little gurgling every so often.
So is the tank making the noise and not the air compressor thing that goes like pump?
No, they don't hear that. They hear the gurgling from that air bubble.
No way.
Down into, yeah.
I installed one of those a couple years ago in a wastewater environment in a wet well. It was a substantially sized wet well that always developed a big grease blanket. No matter what they did to it, they couldn't keep it maintained. And we put one of those guys in, and I thought it was a joke. But that's the design of it, is that big, it's like the size of a maybe not a beach ball, but it's pretty big bubble goes to the top, and they got fantastic results out of it in that environment. So I've seen it in action. It does scare. If you're there talking to a guy in the dry well side of the pump station, that thing goes off your leg. It takes you by surprise. But they said it's very effective in that environment.
I know,
so I can imagine this would work the same way in potable water, that it would mix.
Yeah. So I know Rob and I, working together, put these in a few tanks for AWWA over the past few years, and talking to one of the painters, this is a cool story. The mixer, the air bubbler system was running. The painter had to go into the tank. The tank was full, and they had to go in, I think, to do some touch-up work around an overflow.
Yeah, they
and
asked.
the painter, do you remember the story, Rob?
Yeah, they asked him if he wanted to turn the mixer off, and he had actually installed it. He goes, no, it'll be fine. And they got up in the tank and dropped their little raft in to do their touch-ups, and they were screaming, turn the mixer off.
They couldn't direct the raft. It's like going all, it's mixing the raft. And
Is that
that's
something that they can you dictate the timers on that to what you want to each tank then? How many times you want it to go off so an operator can maintain? That's pretty clever. If that's the way it goes, that's real. I like that.
Yeah. Okay, so we are coming up on 3:15 right now. And so what I'd like to do, just to wrap things up, back to sharing the screen. If you guys enjoyed this roundtable discussion, Entech has a bunch of future roundtables coming up. So we've got another one on water. That's Thursday, September 10th, on regs and emerging contaminants. We've got two on wastewater. They're always a lot of fun. Aerobic digestion, how to get 5 pounds of biosolids out of a 10-pound bag of shit. And October 7th on rehabbing wastewater storage tanks. My good friend Mark Bubel from AWWA, Pennsylvania will be joining our panel. Can't wait for that. We'll also have other fun stuff. Trusted advisor, hired gun, how boards can work best with their engineer. We're considering have a beer with an engineer. We're considering if your name is Bradley Cooper, join my roundtable. So all sorts of fun stuff coming up. And you can go to our website, entecheng.com, and at the very bottom, there's a link to a blog that lists all of our water and wastewater roundtables that are coming up, so you can sign up. So to round things out right now, huge thank you to my panel. Oh my God, you guys are amazing. I learned so much today, and I believe our audience did as well. So big thank you to Rob Horvat with Entech. If you're interested in the PDH certificate or water operator CEH, please send me an email with your name and a license number for the water operator. Huge thank you to my good friend Ralph with Pennsylvania American Water, to my good friend Andy with MBA, to Neil, my new best friend with Durstein. If you've got installation questions, he is the man to go to. And finally, my new friend Tom with AWWA, Pennsylvania. So just to round things out, any other comments from our panel? Anything else you want to add? Yes, Andy.
If you're doing a mixing system during a tank rehab project, get your submittals approved quickly and get your materials ordered as soon as possible. The only holdup we've had is just delays in equipment delivery. So get those approvals in and order soon.
And is that something new in COVID-19 times, like the past 4 months, or has that been true for the past year or two?
It's been true for as long as we've been doing, or incorporating new mixing systems in with the tank rehab projects.
Okay.
There's,
Excellent.
been delays.
Okay. Any other comments or things to share with our audience? Okay, gentlemen, I always say magical things happen when you bring together passionate people. And you guys are all very clearly passionate about tanks and mixers. So thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure seeing you. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Good day.